pleasure it is to welcome to this show Bob Gutkowski. He really, to me, put so many different ventures on the map. I just didn't realize how many until I read his book. So his book has the perfect title, Gut Punch. Former Madison Square Garden president tells the true story of how the Rangers won the Stanley Cup, the Knicks lost Pat Riley, and the Yankees struck gold with the Yes Network. And he had some help on this book with an incredible writer, somebody I followed growing up in New York in the Philly area, Wallace Matthews, who I can't say enough about him, and I'm sure Bob will say too. He was the lead writer for The Post. I just devoured everything he wrote. And this is a really interesting, well-written, funny at times, poignant at times. And just you're saying to yourself, I had no idea that was happening behind the scenes. So without further ado, Bob, you lived it.
Yes, I did, Kate. And it's an honor to be on your show. I'm really happy about it. And I look forward to the conversation.
So let's talk about where you started, because you rose to such high heights, but you had to start somewhere. And people talk about pages. In fact, Tina Fey had a show, a sitcom, where it was heavily emphasized about what pages did. And you had that behind the scenes look. How did you become a page at NBC? That started you off.
Yeah, I did. I think when I was going to college, I was working at CBS in the mailroom. And the head of the mailroom liked me very much. And as I got out of college, it was Vietnam. And, it was a very uncomfortable time and for the world. And I got involved in the first draft. And I got a high lottery number, so I didn't go. But, even with that, people were not hiring young men out of college because of the potential of them, going to Vietnam. So the only job I could get, the head of CBS mailroom said, I know the guy that runs the page system. And he got me a job as a page at NBC and making $90 a week. And I was getting married and I was living with my mother. And, that started, my interest as a page, learning a little bit about the entertainment business. And I couldn't believe they had a sports department. And I'm saying, Jesus, wow, wouldn't that be great to get into sports from a television standpoint? And I really kind of worked it, got to know a lot of people. The relationship I had, he knew Carl Lindemann, the president. I got to know Chet Simmons, who was number 2, became the president, legendary guy who started ESPN. And he liked me very much. And that was my impetus to start, going up the ladder of my sports career.
And what's interesting is you had the sports side, but you also sold ads for SNL, which of course is incredibly iconic. And you're still friends with the creator of SNL, Lorne Michaels, who has one of the biggest names really in comedy. He gave so many people breaks. What was it like selling SNL?
Well, it was, Lorne remains a friend, certainly. He used to come to the Garden a lot. He was a big Nick Brain fan for sure. And we were selling the Tonight Show, the Today Show, a Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder and a Midnight Special. And they started to come out with this new idea, this live late night comedy show on Saturday nights. And they had a very young creator. I think he was 28 years old at that point, a guy named Lorne Michaels from Canada, and Dick Ebersol, who was the head of late night entertainment for NBC. So I went with them to McCann Erickson, my agency of record, and we pitched the idea. They pitched the idea of this live Saturday night show to Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola became the first sponsor in Saturday Night Live, 55 years, how long it is ago. And they were also the first advertiser out of Saturday Night Live, and never came back in. So it was a short-lived relationship. But I got to know Lorne a little bit about that, and that really kind of grew through when I became president of the Garden. And, if I ever call him for anything, he is kind enough to call back, and terrific guy, and the creative mind. It was, unbelievable. And I remained friends with Dick Ebersol as well.
So do you credit the fact that you really kind of worked your way up the business? I mean, selling is a tremendous way to understand how a business grows, and you're there on the front lines, and you had those front row seats to some of the biggest events in sports, essentially, because you got to feed the beast. You got to, it's great. Sports are awesome. I love sports, but you have to have the money behind it. And did you understand that at an early age?
Well, I understood, working at NBC in another area, how important sales was. I mean, it was the lifeblood. Back then you didn't have subscription television. It was either you had, advertiser sales or you did not go on the air. So I understood how important it was. And I originally thought I was going to get into the production side, which is pretty well documented in the book. But that didn't work out. So I did get a job selling late night, and that got me into sports sales. And it gave me the whole real sense of business and the ability to sell. I got into this, and I was picked out of a group of people because I started the football pool, and I had a pretty good gift of gab. And a lot of the sales guys said, "You should be in sales." And I said, "What is that?" And they taught me, and then I wound up getting this job and then getting into sports sales, which was an interesting journey. And it just gave me a sense of the business aspect of it. And I liked it. And I realized that having a sales background in any business, I think, is the best background to have. You can go into so many different areas from sales, where if you are in other areas, you can't go down into sales. So out there for everybody who wants to get into any business and learn about the business and its foundations, get into the sales department, and you will have a great opportunity to grow.
It's interesting. In the very beginning of your book, you talk about "my cup runneth over," and you say, "The first thing I worried about was, can I lift this thing over my head? After all, the Stanley Cup is big. Ring upon silver ring of the names of every player and coach who was ever a member of a team that managed to win it, topped by a big bull enough to feed a Saint Bernard out of." So take us back to that moment, because there you are at the top of the chain, where you have the Rangers, Madison Square Garden, 54 years, what was it, 54 years drought of no cup. And suddenly you're in that position where you're in the playoffs. What was that like for you?
It was a incredible moment. I grew up as a Ranger fan. I understood the frustration and the pain of Ranger fans. We always looked for something to occur that would turn the whole series around, and we would then lose. So even with 6 seconds to go in the seventh game, I still was pretty sure they were going to tie it and then we'd lose. So, but for me, standing there that night, and also one other dimension that was occurring, was the Garden was being sold. So I knew I was going to be gone, especially if Cablevision was one of the buyers. And but it was such an exhilarating, unbelievable evening, and the fans were terrific. They were waiting. And as I held the cup up and I slowly turned around in slow motion, saw all the fans kind of in a circle in my mind, I realized this may be the greatest night in history of Madison Square Garden. Well, certainly, maybe in my lifetime, and I'm not so sure it's ever going to be repeated this way, because of the 54-year drought, because of the ups and downs, and also because of the ugliness that I knew that went behind the scenes to get us there. But I believe you had to go through that ugliness to eventually win the cup. It was preordained. It had to happen. It was the only way to win it after 54 years.
Yeah, and talk about that. What was some of what happened behind the scenes that the fans had no idea was going on?
Well, the fans had a sense that there was an issue between Neil Smith and Mike Keenan, the general manager and the coach. They knew that there were problems, behind the scenes, but not to the depth that certainly were occurring. These guys had not talked for months. There was a real ugliness that was being created between the both of them. And if the general manager and the coach are not talking to each other in the last 2 months to 3 months of the season, you're not going to win the cup.
What went on behind the scenes that people don't know in trying to get Keenan and Smith together?
I don't think the fans or even the writers understood how deep that relationship was, as far as both men not really getting along with each other.
Yeah, so once that was patched up, once that happened, it was a whole different story, right?
Well, I don't think it was ever patched up. I think that it got to a point where we were winning pretty well. We were in first place for a long time in that season. But coming into late February, March, we were struggling. And the Devils, even though we had control over the Devils that year, 6-0 in games, were right behind us. And you could really see the frustration starting to grow. And a couple of days before the trading deadline, probably I think two, I get a call from Rob Campbell, who is the agent of Mike Keenan. And he says to me that Mike wanted me to call you, and he wants to go on record saying that he does not believe this team is good enough to win the Stanley Cup. And he wants you to know that because he's not talking to the general manager. And I said, well, I'm aware that they were not talking. I'm aware of the problems. This really kind of brought it to light to the point where I said, you know what? Have your client in my conference room off my office tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. That night, I saw Neil Smith in the Suite 200. They called it at Madison Square Garden, where the executives would be. And I said, look, I got the call from Rob Campbell. This is what Keenan feels. I want you in my office tomorrow morning.
Wow. So it's so interesting to hear the inner workings of that, because ultimately it leads to a Stanley Cup. And we come back and continue our conversation with Bob Gutkowski. We're going to pick it up there, what the rest of that journey was like. Think about that, starting from a page all the way up to the Madison Square Garden presidency, and even striking gold with the Yes Network and George Steinbrenner. His story is so fascinating. Don't go away. Back with Bob coming up next. All right, we're continuing our conversation with Bob Gutkowski, who was taking us down that road of how do you win a Stanley Cup when you have a coach and you have a GM who just don't get along. So, Bob, ultimately, how did you get deeper and solve the problem?
I have a coach that thinks the team is not good enough. I got a general manager who thinks the team is good enough. I don't believe the team is good enough. I'm concerned, and we're going to figure out what we have to do to get it done. And at that point, I said, Mike, you started off. And Mike said, first of all, Neil, I don't really want your job, because it's been written in the papers that he wanted the general manager's job. And Neil said, oh, Mike, I know you don't. And I said, that's bullshit. Of course you think that. And I understand it's being written in the papers, but it's not going to happen. Mike, you're not becoming the general manager. And Neil, he's not becoming the general manager. So let's keep going. At that point, Mike really started talking hot. And he basically said, look, I'm like a chef. I remember this. And I know if the icing needs a little more sugar, and we need a little bit more sugar. You guys are going to get seduced, was his word, like you did in 92. And we don't have enough grit. We lost in 92, against Pittsburgh. And we need more grit. And he kept going with his hands. We need like this. And I said, well, that's a valid point, but how is Neil Smith going to know we need more sugar if you don't tell him that? So, Neil, how do you respond to that? And they started talking, Kate, and it really became a marvelous deep dive hockey conversation. And I pulled myself out of it, and I watched it for a while. I got up, I left, I went down to my head of communications, Monty Bagley, and I sat down across her, put my feet up on the desk and said, Monty, if we ever win the cup, it's going to be because of this meeting. So even though they didn't like each other, even though they had disagreements on the direction of the team and what should be needed, Neil listened. And Neil went out and did a fantastic job in getting the players that Mike felt he needed. And I believe that was the springboard to get us to the cup. I believe if we didn't have that meeting, we would have never won the cup. And again, those guys had not been talking until that meeting for the last couple of months. So it worked well. And right after it, Neil poked, they were talking about 3 hours. And after it, Neil poked his head in my office and said, Bob, thanks. I didn't think that was going to work, but I know what Mike needs. And now I have to go out and get it. And he did.
And then you win the cup, like you said, you look around, it's like slow motion. What was that parade like?
The parade was great. The parade is something, growing up a Yankee hater, the only time you saw that parade was with the New York Yankees, so you never even thought you'd be in one. And the town was ecstatic. The town was crazy. It became a hockey town immediately. And, just seeing the faces of the people because you're right there. And the biggest expression I got more than anything was thank you. Not we're the best, we're number one. It was thank you. Now I can die in peace, one of the signs said, So there are many stories. There's a great story that's in the book. Al Troutwig, one of the announcers, lived in Glen Head, New York, and he went to a deli all the time. And the owner of the deli's father died recently, but an incredible Ranger fan, but left instructions to his son that they put a pipe down by his where he was buried with a cap that would open up. And he said, if the Rangers ever win the Stanley Cup, you tell me down in the pipe, So the son the next day went down, opened up, and said, "Dad, we won 3-2." So, the Ranger fans are the greatest fans in the world, and they wanted a cup so badly, and you just, the fear of losing was pretty deep because it would have been such a disappointment, especially if we lost to the New Jersey Devils.
Right. I mean, talk about a rivalry, and you're right there in the backyard. So absolutely. Before the whole sale, and we'll talk about that, but Madison Square Garden itself is iconic now. People come from all over the country, even if they hate the teams playing them that play their hometown teams, to get a ticket there and to sit there. There is something about it. It's like a cathedral of sports. I felt that the first time that I went there. I understood what it was like. So for you, here you are, the president of Madison Square Garden, and you see that there are some things that aren't happening at the Garden. You and I had a great conversation about boxing and how you made that a profitable situation for the Garden. Tell people about that, because I don't think they realize some of the beginnings of where boxing was really highlighted.
Well, you made the statement that it's iconic, it's well known, it's a cathedral. The world knows Madison Square Garden, but the reason why the world knows Madison Square Garden is not because of the Knicks and not because of the Rangers or even concerts. The world knows the Garden because of all the boxing that went on, in 1900s, 40s, 50s, 30s, 60s. And it became this unbelievably well-known icon. And it came to a real clarity for me when at one point I was over in London and I had one of those black cab, one of those great old English drivers turned around to me and he said, so mate, what do you do? And I said, look, I don't know if you ever heard of this, but I'm the president of Madison Square Garden. And he turned around and he looked at me and he says, isn't that where they bop themselves on the nose?
Take us inside the ropes. How did the whole boxing thing unfold?
I had conversations with Dan Duva and Lou Duva, legendary boxing managers and trainers, to buy their company, Main Fights, Main Events. And we had a deal done. And we would have had Holyfield and so many of in their stable immediately becoming Madison Square Garden boxing. But the head of Paramount hated boxing and he killed the deal. So we went out on our own and tried and do what we could. I went out and got a great guy named Bobby Goodman who worked for Don King as the head of the boxing department. And we started promoting fights, not just renting fights. And we started signing fighters. And we started to come back, not to any great extent. But one of the things I did do is when I was vice president of program for ESPN, I was in charge of boxing, obviously. And I wanted to do a new series called Saturday Night at the Fights. Originally it's Caesar's Palace, but they turned it down. But I got to know all the promoters would come in. Finally, they could put a fight on ESPN. And I got to know Jimmy Jacobs and Bill Cayton fairly well. And they had a great fighter named Edwin Rosario, lightweight, was terrific. And I wanted to put him on ESPN. And when I was at Paramount, after I left ESPN, I started reading about this kid upstate in articles, this Mike Tyson, 17 years old. And I was fascinated not only by him, but the fact that he was trained by Customato, legendary Floyd Patterson, Jose Torres, and managed by Jimmy Jacobs, because they were very close. So when I got to Madison Square Garden, I wanted to bring Mike Tyson to New York. He'd never been in New York. And he was 18 years old at this point. So I sat down and had a breakfast with Jimmy Jacobs, who liked me very much and said, and he would call me Robert. Robert, I would like nothing better than to put Mike Tyson in New York. It fell for him at that particular point. But Mark Breland, who was a great Olympic fighter, fought a couple of weeks before, and he fought an 8-round fight for 5,000. And Jimmy said that John Condon, the great announcer who ran boxing, would only give us 4 rounds at 2,500. He says, I won't do that. I will fight for 5,000 like Breland, not $1 more, not $1 less, and I want 8 rounds. I said, well, let me see if I can pull it off. So I went back to Condon. He was pretty steadfast. And I said, let me tell you something. I'll throw in $2,500 for MSG Network. We'll do an 8-round fight. You only have to pay 25, and we'll see what happens. He agreed. That Friday night, it was packed. You had trucks from WCBS, WNBC, WABC. It was this incredible night at the Garden in the Fell Forum. And Mike beat Sammy Scarf in 58 seconds, I think. But it was a great success. And when I came in Monday morning, Jack Crumpy, who was the president of the Garden, and Alan Fields, who was the chief operating officer, said to me, you're now in charge of boxing.
So he's in charge of boxing, and then that just grew and grew and grew. And he went on to so many other fascinating things. I don't think that and he said this to me, that he could have imagined where he ended up, and it all started back at Saturday Night Live when it was not Saturday Night Live, and he was selling it and learning the ropes and working for those networks and then getting to ESPN. And what was ESPN like? And it was also in those beginning stages where so much was happening. And now you look at the world of sports and how it's exploded beyond, I think, maybe even what originally some people thought you could see collectively as far as sports go. And he was there on the cutting edge of all of that, where he was working with some incredible people and had a front row seat to some amazing events, and created some of those events, like what he was talking about there with Mike Tyson, and being aware of Tyson and what he was capable of. And now we fast forward to Tyson coming up in November for a big fight at Texas Stadium. That should be interesting. Ooh. All right, my friends, thanks to the Minnesota 2. Be safe, be sane, and happy.
Visit us at www.greatwritersmedia.com. Email us at info@greatwritersmedia.com or call us at +1 877 556 0487.